The scorched air over Redemption Creek tasted of dust and distant broken promises of rain. It clung to the back of Clayton Reeves's throat as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast blue anvil of the sky, beating the life out of the parched land and the weary souls who called it home. Clayton was one of them. A man hollowed out by silence, seeking to fill the void with the simple mundane rhythm of supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and a small bag of peppermint sticks he had no one to give to, but bought out of a stubborn, forgotten habit. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried goods leather and chewing tobacco. He exchanged a gruff nod with Silas Croft, the proprietor, a man whose face was a roadmap of every drought and hard winter the territory had endured. As Silas weighed out the flour, the lazy afternoon calm was shattered. It began not with a bang, but with a scream, a high, sharp sound of terror from the street that cut through the drone of flies. Then came the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Another scream, this one choked off. Clayton's body reacted before his mind could process the chaos. Years of training as an Army scout, instincts buried under layers of lonely ranch work, surged to the surface. He dropped the sack of flour which burst on the floorboards in a white cloud and moved toward the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "Get down, Silas." He yelled, his voice a raw command that brooked no argument. He peered through the grimy window. Two masked men were backing out of the First Territorial Bank across the street, canvas bags clutched in their fists. A third stood guard, firing his pistol into the air to keep the townsfolk scattered and terrified. The town's lone sheriff, a man more suited to settling disputes over fences than facing down armed robbers, lay motionless near the water trough, a dark stain spreading across his chest. A cold rage, familiar and unwelcome, tightened in Clayton's gut. It was the rage of helplessness, the same feeling that had gnawed at him for 8 long years. He drew his Colt, the weight of it, a solid, deadly comfort in his hand. He wasn't the law, but he was here. He could do something. He had to. He burst out of the store, taking cover behind a stack of barrels. The air was acrid with gunpowder. He raised his pistol, took aim at the guard, his finger tightening on the trigger. But just as he was about to fire, a fourth figure emerged from the bank, stumbling backward. This one was smaller, slighter, and the mask had slipped, revealing the lower half of a face. And then the figure turned. It was a woman. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Clayton saw her clearly in the brutal afternoon sun. Her hair, a cascade of fiery auburn, had come loose from under her hat. Her eyes, wide and green, were not cold or cruel, but filled with a desperate, hunted terror that struck him with the force of a physical blow. She clutched a pistol, but held it awkwardly, as if it were a venomous snake she'd been forced to grasp. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the dusty street. In that moment, he saw not a hardened criminal, but a soul cornered by circumstance. The hesitation cost him. One of the other robbers, seeing him, spun around and fired. The bullet didn't find Clayton's flesh, but it slammed into the barrel next to his head, sending a spray of splinters into his face. The impact threw him off balance. He staggered back, his head, ringing a sharp pain lancing through his temple. By the time he cleared his vision, blinking away the sting of wood and sweat, they were gone, mounted, and galloping out of town, leaving a trail of dust, fear, and the dead sheriff behind them. Clayton slammed his fist against the barrel, the rough wood scraping his knuckles raw. He hadn't fired a single shot. He had seen, he had hesitated, and he had failed. The image of the woman's desperate green eyes was seared into his memory, a brand of his own inadequacy. It was the same old story, the same bitter taste of failure he knew from a lifetime ago, from a place called Fort Robinson, where his inaction had cost a good man his honor and ultimately his life. He had retreated from the world to escape that ghost, but here it was, resurrected in the eyes of an auburn-haired bank robber in a forgotten town called Redemption Creek. The silence that greeted Clayton at his ranch was a physical presence, a heavy blanket woven from loneliness and regret. It lived in the empty chair across his dinner table, in the dust motes dancing in the shafts of fading sunlight through the windows of rooms no one ever entered. For 8 years this silence had been his only companion, a penance for the life he had failed to save. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a solitary outpost carved from a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The canyon walls bled shades of ochre and crimson under the unforgiving sun, and the wind whispered through the sagebrush with a mournful sigh, a constant reminder of his isolation. He had built the house himself with strong hands and a heart full of hope for a future that had never arrived. Now its sturdy walls served only to amplify the emptiness within. After the chaos in town, the quiet was even more profound. He tended to his chores with a grim mechanical efficiency, mending a fence post, watering the horses, checking the chickens. But his mind was miles away, trapped in the dusty street of Redemption Creek, replaying that single paralyzing moment of hesitation. The woman's eyes, why had they stopped him? Later, inside the cavernous kitchen, he set a single plate, a single fork, a single cup on the rough-hewn wooden table. The routine was a nightly ritual of self-inflicted punishment. As he ate the tasteless stew, his gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a tarnished cavalry saber lay beside a faded photograph of 2 young men in uniform, and their arms slung around each other's shoulders in a moment of easy camaraderie. One was a younger, smiling version of himself. The other was Lieutenant James Harper. The ghost, the memory of Fort Robinson, was a wound that had never properly healed. He, a civilian scout, had uncovered a rot deep within the quartermaster corps, a conspiracy of officers skimming profits from supply contracts, providing shoddy goods to the soldiers who depended on them. James, his friend, had been caught in the middle, pressured by his superiors to look the other way. Clayton had pushed, demanding justice, demanding that James do the right thing. But in his righteous fury, he had failed to see the trap closing around another officer, a good man named Captain Vance, who was being set up to take the fall for everyone. By the time Clayton realized the truth, it was too late. Vance was ruined, his career destroyed. The guilt had been a poison in their friendship, and Clayton had left the Army unable to face the man he had inadvertently helped destroy, or the friend he felt he had failed. That failure was the reason for this house, this silence. It was the reason he was now a 35-year-old man, waiting on a mail-order bride. The arrangement with Margaret Sullivan, a 22-year-old schoolteacher from Kansas, was his last desperate gamble against the encroaching wilderness of his own soul. Her letters were filled with gentle prose and quiet hopes for a new beginning. She sounded kind, steady. She sounded like peace. He had sent her the money for her passage, built a new bookshelf for the books she promised to bring, and allowed a fragile tendril of hope to take root in the barren soil of his heart. He washed his single plate and stared out the window at the horizon, where the dust of the approaching stagecoach would soon appear. He was a man who didn't shy away from trouble, who had faced down dangers most men only read about in dime novels. But the thought of meeting this woman, of trying to build a life from the wreckage of his past, filled him with a terror far greater than any gunfight. He was expecting a stranger who represented a chance at redemption. He was not prepared for the ghost who was about to step off that coach and drag his past kicking and screaming into his present. The dust cloud on the horizon grew a smudge of brown against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. Clayton stood by the wooden fence, clutching the last letter from Margaret, its edges softened from countless readings. The words promised a new life. The grinding of the stagecoach wheels slowing to a stop was the sound of that life beginning. The driver, a grizzled man named Hank, called out a greeting. "Brought you your passenger, Reeves?" The coach door creaked open. Clayton held his breath. A woman descended, but his world, already unsteady, tilted on its axis. It wasn't the plain, gentle face from the small photograph Margaret had sent. This woman's hair was a familiar shade of auburn, catching the last rays of the sun like spun copper. Her face was pale-etched with an exhaustion so profound it seemed carved into her very bones. But it was her eyes that made the air leave Clayton's lungs in a sudden sharp gasp. They were green, and they were the same desperate, haunted eyes he had seen just hours ago, staring back at him over the barrel of a gun. Before he could speak to deny the impossible reality before him, the scene became even more surreal. Behind her, a parade of small figures emerged from the coach. A boy of about 15, his shoulders squared with a defiant, premature manhood. Two younger boys, their faces smudged with dirt and curiosity. And two little girls, the youngest, clinging to her mother's worn dress, her thumb tucked firmly in her mouth. 5 children. The woman approached him, her steps slow but steady, her chin held high in a gesture of weary pride. The setting sun cast long shadows that stretched between them like an impassable chasm. "You must be Clayton Reeves," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd imagined, musical but frayed at the edges with strain. "I'm Lillian Harper." The name meant nothing and everything. It wasn't Margaret Sullivan. It was just a name. But the face was a nightmare made real. Clayton stared from her to the crumpled letter in his hand, a talisman that had suddenly lost all its power. He had prepared his heart for one person, a quiet schoolteacher. Not a family of 6, not her. The eldest boy, Thomas, moved to his mother's side, his gaze flicking from Clayton to the vast, empty landscape surrounding them. He looked like a soldier guarding the last outpost. Lillian's green eyes, the very same eyes, met his. But now up close, he saw they held not the coldness of a criminal, but the profound, heartbreaking weariness of a mother, pushed to the absolute limit of her endurance. A flicker of recognition passed between them, not of the robbery, but of something deeper. 2 solitary souls adrift in a harsh world, suddenly and inexplicably colliding. "I think," Lillian said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "we may both be exactly where we're supposed to be." Her words hung in the air, a statement of faith or a desperate plea. Hank, the driver, was already unloading their meager belongings, a collection of worn satchels and patched bundles that told a story of a life packed in haste and desperation. Clayton's mind was a maelstrom of confusion and suspicion. Was this a trick, a coincidence so profound it defied belief? Or was the woman from the bank now standing on his porch using a different name, bringing her brood of children as the perfect cover? His promise of a new life had just become a confrontation with the very violence and failure he had tried to escape. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Clayton's carefully ordered world had just been invaded, and the woman at the center of the storm was a mystery he had to solve, a threat he had to face, even as some forgotten part of him responded to the profound vulnerability in her gaze. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in Clayton's stomach, overriding the flicker of sympathy he'd felt. He unfolded the letter again, as if the ink and paper could somehow correct the impossible reality before him. Margaret Sullivan. The name was clear. The woman standing before him was not her. Lillian saw the rigid set of his jaw, the hard glint in his eyes. "There seems to be some confusion, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The wagon driver said this was the right address. But perhaps you were expecting someone else. I was—" Clayton said, his voice flat and hard. The 2 words fell like stones between them. Thomas, the eldest, bristled at his tone. "Mom, maybe we should go back to town, find somewhere else." His voice was a boy's, but his words were a man's. "With what money, Thomas?" Lillian's reply was sharp with a desperation she could no longer conceal. She turned her gaze back to Clayton, a silent appeal in her eyes. "We spent everything we had to get here." Clayton's eyes scanned the children. 5 small faces watching him, their expressions a heartbreaking mix of fear and a fragile childlike hope. They were innocent pawns in a game he didn't understand. His gaze fell back on Lillian. "How did you get my name?" He demanded, the question coming out harsher than he intended. How did you know to come here? Lillian reached into the pocket of her worn coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a page torn from a newspaper, creased and smudged. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a spark of warmth against the cold steel of his suspicion. He recognized it instantly, his own advertisement. A woman at the train station in Kansas City gave this to me. Lillian explained, her voice low and steady. She said her name was Margaret Sullivan. She told me her plans had changed, that she couldn't make the journey west. She saw my children. She saw our situation. And she gave me her ticket and your letter. She said perhaps you were a good man who might be interested in a different arrangement. The story was plausible. Too plausible. Margaret had simply changed her mind, taken his money, and in a fit of charity passed her ticket to a destitute widow. It felt too convenient. Too clean. The youngest child, a little girl with hair the color of corn silk, tugged on Lillian's skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry," she whispered, her small voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. The sound broke through Clayton's wall of suspicion. He saw Lillian's composure crack for just a moment as she bent down her hand, stroking the child's hair with infinite tenderness. "I know, sweetheart. We'll figure something out soon." He was looking at a mother trying to hold her world together for her children. He was also looking at a woman who looked exactly like a bank robber. The two images warred in his mind. Then his gaze fell on the scrap of newspaper in his hand. Tucked into the fold was a small, handwritten note he hadn't noticed before. The pencil was faint, but the words were clear. Lillian Harper, Council Bluffs. Council Bluffs. The site of the robbery. The knot in his stomach cinched tighter. "You were in Council Bluffs," he stated, not a question. Lillian's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her features. "Yes. We lost the farm nearby. We were staying in a boarding house there before we had to leave." The stagecoach was now just a speck in the distance. The sun had sunk below the horizon, and the chill of the high desert evening was beginning to creep in. He was alone with them, a potential criminal, and her 5 children. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road. Not one horse, but several moving at a steady, purposeful clip. Clayton's hand went to his Colt, his body tensing. He motioned for Lillian and the children to move back toward the house. 3 riders emerged from the twilight, and their figures dark silhouettes against the fading light. As they drew closer, Clayton recognized the man in the lead. The posture, the way he sat his horse, it was unmistakable. Evening Clayton. The lead rider called out, his voice a familiar gravelly drawl. He swung down from his horse, the silver star on his vest, glinting in the faint light. "Been a while." "Marcus." Clayton acknowledged, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though his hand remained near his weapon. "Heard you pinned on a U.S. Marshal's badge." "That I did." Marcus Whitley said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He was a man weathered by the sun and the law, and his gaze missed nothing. It swept over the scene: Clayton, the woman, the 5 children huddled on the porch, the meager luggage. "We're tracking the crew that hit the bank in Council Bluffs. Trail led us out this way." Clayton's blood ran cold. One of the witnesses gave a solid description of the woman involved. Marcus continued, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp and focused on Lillian. Said she had auburn hair and green eyes. Traveling with children to throw off suspicion. Goes by the name Lillian Harper. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A wanted poster. Clayton felt the world shrink to the space between him and the marshal. He stood between this family and the law. Lillian's face was a mask of pale, terrified disbelief. He had a choice. He could trust his gut, the cold certainty that this woman was the one from the bank, and hand her over. It would be the safe thing to do. the logical thing. Or he could trust the other instinct, the one that had stirred at the sight of her stroking her daughter's hair. Yet the instinct that recognized the scent of desperation, not deceit. He looked at the children, their eyes wide and frightened in the gathering dark. He remembered the promise he'd made to James Harper all those years ago, a foolish emotional promise to protect a soldier's family no matter the cost. Was this a test? A cruel joke from beyond the grave? He made his decision. The woman I have here came on the afternoon stage, Marcus. Clayton set his voice a low, steady rumble that defied the tremor in his soul. Her name's Margaret Sullivan, my mail-order bride. The lie was out huge and irreversible, settling over the yard like a shroud. He had just declared himself protector of a wanted woman, an accessory to a federal crime. He had just gambled his freedom, his ranch, his entire life, on the desperate hope that the woman with the familiar green eyes was not who the law said she was. Marcus Whitley studied Clayton's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. He knew Clayton of old, knew him as a man of few words and unwavering integrity. The lie spoken with such conviction seemed to give him pause. Margaret Sullivan, you say? Marcus repeated slowly, his gaze shifting to Lillian, who stood frozen on the porch, her face a pale oval in the gloom. Ma'am, forgive my asking, but would you mind confirming that? Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked from the marshal's searching eyes to Clayton, who gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. He had just thrown her a lifeline, a lie so bold it might just work. She swallowed hard, finding her voice in the terrified recesses of her throat. Yes, Marshal, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. I'm Margaret Sullivan. The lie felt foreign on her tongue, a bitter pill. Behind her, she could feel Thomas's confusion and fear radiating like heat. The children knew their own name. This was a dangerous, desperate game. Marcus grunted, his eyes still narrowed. Funny. The driver in town mentioned he dropped off a Mrs. Harper and her children. Driver must have misheard. Clayton cut in smoothly, stepping forward slightly to draw the marshal's attention back to him. Long, dusty ride. Easy to get names mixed up. You know how Hank is after a few pulls from his flask. It was a weak explanation, but it was all he had. Marcus continued to stare, weighing Clayton's word against the evidence. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his long pursuit, he folded the wanted poster and tucked it back into his vest. Could be, he conceded, though his tone was laced with skepticism. Trail's gone cold out here anyway. We'll make camp down by the creek for the night. Head back to town at first light and see if any other leads have come in. He turned to his deputies. Let's water the horses. As the other men moved toward the well, Marcus walked his horse closer to the porch, his voice dropping low so only Clayton could hear. Listen to me, Clayton. We go back a ways. I know you're a square man. But if I find out you're harboring a fugitive, our friendship won't stop me from clapping you in irons right alongside her. You understand me? Understood, Clayton said, his face a granite mask. The marshals rode off toward the creek, their figures swallowed by the darkness. The immediate danger had passed, but a new, more profound tension remained. Clayton turned to face Lillian. The lie he had told now bound them together, for better or worse. Get the children inside. He said, his voice quiet but firm. Don't let them near the windows. They'll be watching the house. Inside, the warm lamplight did little to dispel the chill of fear. Lillian quickly and quietly settled the younger children in the spare rooms upstairs, her movements efficient and graceful despite the terror that made her hands shake. She told them it was a game, a campout. But Thomas, wise beyond his years, knew better. He stayed downstairs, his young face a mixture of fear and a fierce protective resolve. When Lillian returned to the kitchen, she found Clayton standing by the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness where the marshals were camped. Why did you do that? She whispered, her voice raw. Why did you lie for me? Clayton turned from the window, his face grim in the flickering light. Because I don't believe you're a thief. And I don't send women and children to jail on the word of a single witness and a poor drawing. He paused, his gaze intense. But I need you to tell me the truth, Lillian. All of it. Starting with how Margaret Sullivan's ticket and my letter ended up in your hands. Lillian sank into a chair at the table, the last of her strength seeming to desert her. She told him everything. The death of her husband James from a sudden fever. The loss of their small farm to the bank. The desperate move to a boarding house in Council Bluffs and the dwindling funds that had finally run out. The landlady told us we had to be out by the end of the week. She explained, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I had nowhere to go. I took the children to the train station thinking we could... I don't know what I was thinking. Just that we couldn't stay. She described the woman she'd met there, a woman with a kind face and sad eyes who called herself Margaret Sullivan. She saw us, saw how desperate I was. She said she'd had a change of heart about coming west, that it wasn't the life for her. She gave me her things, the ticket, your letter, the advertisement. She even gave me the last of her cash. She called it an act of providence. Providence. Clayton repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. Or a setup. He began to pace the kitchen floor, his mind working furiously. This woman. Did she look like you? A little, Lillian admitted. Her hair was lighter, more brown than red. But she was about my height. It was all too perfect. A desperate widow, a convenient look-alike, a wanted poster. Someone had woven a very careful net, and Lillian had flown right into it. But who and why? There's more. Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a sealed yellowed envelope. Before James died, he gave me this. He made me promise not to open it unless we were in the direst trouble. He said it contained the name of a man he trusted implicitly, a man who had made him a promise. She pushed the envelope across the table. On the front, in her husband's familiar script, was a name, Clayton Reeves. The past had finally caught up to him. Clayton took the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. The promise, spoken in anger and regret in a dusty office at Fort Robinson, had become a ghost sent to claim its due. He knew with a sinking certainty that whatever was in this letter, it would change everything. For the next few days, an uneasy truce settled over the ranch. Clayton kept a constant, wary eye on the creek, where Marcus and his men were camped, but the marshals made no move. It was a waiting game. Under the shadow of the law, a strange and fragile domesticity began to take root. Lillian, true to her word, was no one's charity case. She rose before dawn, her quiet efficiency transforming the dusty, neglected house into a home. The scent of baking bread replaced the smell of loneliness, and the sound of children's laughter, tentative at first, then more confident, began to fill the silent rooms. Clayton watched her, his internal conflict deepening with every passing hour. He saw the gentle way she settled a squabble between the younger boys, the patience with which she helped her daughter with a tangled shoelace, the fierce, unwavering love in her eyes when she looked at her children. This was not the hardened criminal from the wanted poster. His intellect warred with his instinct, but his heart, a part of him, he thought long dead, was slowly, cautiously taking Lillian's side. He found himself talking more than he had in years. He taught Thomas how to properly mend a fence line, recognizing in the boy's quiet competence and sense of duty a reflection of his younger self. He showed the younger boys how to whittle figures from scraps of wood. He even found himself smiling as the two little girls, Sarah and Emily, presented him with a bouquet of wilting wildflowers. One afternoon, he found Lillian in the barn, her face streaked with dirt as she struggled to muck out a stall. "That's my job," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. She leaned on the pitchfork, pushing a stray strand of auburn hair from her forehead. "We are a family of 6, Mr. Reeves. We create a lot of work. The least I can do is help clean up after it. Clayton, he corrected her. A small smile touched her lips. Lillian? They worked in a comfortable silence for a while. The rhythm of their labor, a conversation in itself. The bond between them was growing an unspoken thing woven from shared labor and mutual predicament. But the threat remained. That evening, Clayton knew he could wait no longer. He had to know the truth not just about Lillian, but about the web she was caught in. I have to ride to town, he announced after supper. I need to send a telegraph. Lillian's face paled. To the marshal? No, he said. To Fort Robinson. I need to ask some questions about your husband, about his service. He also needed to discreetly ask Silas Croft and others in Redemption Creek if they'd seen any strangers asking questions before the robbery, any pieces that might fit this puzzle. And I need to get a reply to my inquiries about the robbery itself. It's too dangerous, she protested. The marshals could be watching the road. I'll be careful. I know these hills better than they do. He looked at Thomas. You're in charge while I'm gone. Bar the door after me. Don't open it for anyone but me. Understand? Thomas nodded, his young face grave. Yes, sir. Clayton rode out under the cover of a moonless night, his scout senses on high alert. He slipped past the marshal's camp unseen, a ghost moving through the darkness. The ride to Redemption Creek was fraught with tension, every shadow a potential threat. In town, he roused the telegraph operator, a sleepy man named Peters, and sent 2 coded messages. The first to an old contact in the Army Records Office requesting the service file of Lieutenant James Harper and any information on a Captain Vance. The second to a contact in the U.S. Marshal Service in Omaha asking for details about the Council Bluffs robbery, specifically any other witnesses or evidence that might contradict the single identification of Lillian. As he waited for the clicking reply, he sought out Silas Croft. Over a clandestine bottle of whiskey in the back of the store, he asked his questions carefully. Had any strangers been in town lately? Anyone asking about him or about the stagecoach routes? Silas stroked his beard, thinking. Come to think of it, yeah. About a week ago, a woman stayed a few nights at the boarding house, asked a lot of questions, asked about you particular-like. Asked when you were expecting your bride to arrive. Clayton's blood ran cold. What did she look like? Dressed nice, but her eyes were hard, Silas recalled. Dark auburn hair, I think. Didn't give a name. Said she was a writer for some Eastern newspaper doing a story on life in the West. I didn't think nothing of it at the time. The net had been woven long before Lillian ever set foot in Kansas City. This was personal. This was about him. He returned to the telegraph office just as a reply started clicking through from Omaha. Clayton scribbled down the decoded message. Council Bluffs robbery. One witness ID'd Harper. Witness since disappeared. No other positive IDs. Bank teller mentioned robber's left hand was missing 2 fingers. Repeat, 2 fingers missing on left hand. Clayton looked down at his own hands, then thought of Lillian's. He had watched her knead-dough men clothing braid her daughter's hair. Both of her hands were perfect, slender, and capable. He had his proof. Lillian was innocent. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a chilling realization. If this was a frame-up, the person behind it was still out there. And they had sent Lillian to him for a reason. Back at the ranch, long before dawn, he found Lillian awake in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. He told her what he'd learned. The relief that washed over her face was so profound, it was painful to watch. The tears she had held back for so long finally fell silent tracks on her weary face. I knew it, she whispered. I knew I wasn't going crazy. You're not. Clayton said, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. But you are in more danger than ever. He hesitated, then made a decision. Among your husband's things. Did he leave anything else? A box old papers? Lillian frowned, thinking. There was a small footlocker. His service papers, some old letters. I packed it. They found it at the bottom of a trunk. It was a simple wooden box bound in iron. It was locked. Clayton pried it open carefully with a knife. Inside, bundled in twine, were James Harper's neatly ordered military records letters from Lillian and a packet of official-looking documents tied with a faded red ribbon. But underneath it all was a small leather-bound daguerreotype case. Clayton opened it. His breath caught in his throat. It was an old Army photograph taken at Fort Robinson. 3 officers stood together, their uniforms crisp, their expressions confident. On the right was a young, smiling James Harper. In the center was Captain Vance, the man whose ruin had haunted Clayton for 8 years. And on the left, standing beside her husband, was a woman. Her hair was a dark, rich auburn. Her features were sharp and intelligent. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which held a cool, appraising quality. Clayton had seen her face before in Silas Croft's description, and in the fleeting, nightmarish glimpse he'd had of the true bank robber. He felt the last piece of the puzzle slam into place. "Who is she?" Lillian asked, peering over his shoulder. That," Clayton said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "is Nora Vance, Captain Vance's wife." The telegraph from Fort Robinson arrived the next day, delivered by a boy from town who rode with the caution of someone carrying a rattlesnake. The message was brief and cryptic, but it confirmed Clayton's fears. Captain Alistair Vance, disgraced in a supply contract scandal 8 years prior, had taken his own life 6 months after his discharge. He left behind a wife, Nora, who had disappeared shortly thereafter. The file also noted that Lieutenant James Harper had been a junior officer under Vance's command and had provided testimony during the inquiry. The vendetta was no longer a theory. It was a cold, hard fact. Nora Vance blamed James Harper and Clayton Reeves for her husband's downfall and death. She had engineered a diabolical revenge, a plan to destroy them both from beyond the grave. By framing James's widow for a crime and sending her directly into the path of the other man, she held responsible. She had intended for the law to be her instrument of vengeance. Clayton explained it all to Lillian in the quiet of the kitchen, the wanted poster and the photograph of Nora Vance lying side by side on the table. 2 women with auburn hair, 2 souls on opposite sides of a moral universe. "She wanted me to turn you in." Clayton concluded, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and a strange protective resolve. "She wanted me to send my friend's widow and his children to prison. Or worse." Lillian stared at the photograph of the smiling, confident woman who had orchestrated their nightmare. "This is madness. This is revenge," Clayton corrected her. "And it's not over. Her plan failed. I didn't hand you over to Marcus. Now she knows something went wrong. She'll be coming here herself." The knowledge settled over the ranch, like a physical chill seeping into the newly found warmth of the home. The laughter of the children now seemed fragile, the peace of their small sanctuary, a delicate illusion about to be shattered. The threat was no longer an abstract legal problem represented by Marshal Whitley's badge. It was a woman with hard eyes and a heart full of hate, and she was coming for them. The waiting began. Clayton became a sentinel, his scout senses honed to a razor's edge. He spent his days patrolling the perimeter of his land and his nights awake by the window, the rifle never far from his hand. He taught Thomas how to handle a shotgun, the grim lesson passing between them in hushed, serious tones in the gray light of dawn. Nora Vance did not reveal herself with a frontal assault. Her attack was insidious, a campaign of psychological terror designed to fray their nerves and turn their sanctuary into a prison. It started small. A freshly cut fence line in the north pasture, allowing half the cattle to wander off into the canyons. It took Clayton and Thomas a full day under the punishing sun to round them up. It could have been an accident, but Clayton knew better. A few days later, Lillian went to the well to draw water and found the rope frayed, nearly snapped through. If it had broken with a full bucket, she would have been pulled down into the dark, stony depths. Clayton replaced it, his jaw set in a grim, hard line. The nights became the worst. Strange sounds echoed from the darkness, a rock thrown against the roof, a mournful cry that might have been a coyote or might have been something else entirely. The children grew restless and fearful, their sleep plagued by nightmares. Clayton and Lillian took turns sitting watch their hushed conversations in the dead of night, forging their bond into something stronger than steel. They were no longer a rancher and a desperate widow. They were partners, soldiers holding a besieged fort. One morning, Lillian stepped onto the porch and let out a small, choked cry. On the top step lay a small dead bird, its neck neatly wrung. It was a message, a threat, a promise of what was to come. That was the last straw for Clayton. "She's trying to isolate us," he said, his voice a low growl. "Trying to make us panic, make a mistake." He turned to Lillian, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "I have to get you and the children out of here. I can take you to the next town, put you on a train east." Lillian looked at him, her green eyes unwavering. "And what about you?" "I'll stay. This is my fight. She's here for me as much as for you." "No," Lillian said, her voice quiet but absolute. She placed her hand on his arm, and the simple touch was an anchor in the storm. "James sent me to you for protection, Clayton. But we protect each other now. This is our home. This is our fight. We will not run." Her courage stunned him. In that moment, she was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a warrior standing her ground. The mail-order bride he had never wanted had become a partner he couldn't imagine living without. The sky began to change the next afternoon. The brilliant, unforgiving blue faded to a sickly yellow-gray. The wind, which had been a constant sighing presence, fell silent. An eerie, oppressive stillness descended upon the canyon, broken only by the nervous lowing of the cattle. "Dust storm's coming." Clayton set his eyes on the bruised horizon. A bad one. They worked with a frantic shared purpose, herding the animals into the barn, reinforcing the windows of the house, filling every bucket and basin with water. The sky grew darker, the air thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The storm hit, not with a roar, but with a sudden violent wall of sand and wind that slammed into the house like a physical blow. The world outside disappeared into a swirling brown chaos. The wind howled like a banshee, a symphony of shrieks and moans that rattled the very foundations of the house. Inside, the dim light of the oil lamps cast long dancing shadows, turning familiar objects into monstrous shapes. They were trapped. Clayton, Lillian, and the 5 children sealed in a wooden box at the mercy of the storm's fury. And Clayton knew with the chilling certainty of a man who has looked death in the face before that Nora Vance was out there in the storm. She would use the cover of the chaos. The siege was over. The final battle was about to begin. The house became a claustrophobic tomb, the howling wind, a constant nerve-shredding scream. Sand fine as flour forced its way through every crack, coating every surface in a gritty film. The children were huddled together in the main room, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. Lillian read to them in a low, steady voice, a small island of calm in the raging tempest. Clayton moved through the house like a caged panther, checking the locks, the shutters, his rifle, a permanent extension of his arm. Every creak of the straining timbers, every rattle of a loose window pane sounded like an intruder's footstep. The attack came from the kitchen. A sudden sharp crash of splintering wood as the back door, weakened by the storm's assault, was kicked in. A blast of wind and sand tore through the room, extinguishing one of the lamps and plunging half the house into deeper shadow. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, wrapped in a duster, a scarf covering the lower half of her face. It was Nora Vance. Thomas, get your mother and the others into the bedroom. Bar the door. Clayton commanded, his voice cutting through the wind's roar. He didn't wait for a reply, moving to put himself between Nora and the rest of the house. Nora pulled down the scarf, revealing a face twisted by a grief that had curdled into pure hatred. Her eyes, cold and dark, burned with an unholy fire. Reeves, she spat, her voice surprisingly strong against the storm. The righteous scout. I knew you wouldn't have the stomach to let the law handle her. You always did have a soft spot for another man's wife. It's over, Nora. Clayton set his rifle leveled at her chest. Marshal Whitley knows the truth. They're looking for you now. She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that was nearly lost in the wind. The law. The law is a fool's game. It's what broke my husband. It's what let men like you and James Harper walk away clean while he put a pistol in his mouth. From the other room, Lillian's voice called out firm and clear. We had nothing to do with your husband's death. Nora's burning gaze shifted past Clayton, locking onto the doorway, where Lillian stood refusing to hide. Nothing to do with it. Your husband stood by and let them make Alistair the scapegoat. He was weak. And this one. She gestured at Clayton with her pistol. He was the catalyst, the self-righteous meddler who lit the fuse and then walked away from the explosion, leaving better men to be consumed by the fire. She took a step into the room, the wind whipping her coat around her. I orchestrated it all so perfectly. I used your name, Mrs. Harper, a name already tarnished by your husband's cowardice, to rob that bank. I left a trail of breadcrumbs for the law to follow a trail that led right to the doorstep of the other man I blamed. I wanted him. She snarled, her eyes on Clayton. To have to look your children in the eye as he sent their mother to the gallows. I wanted him to be haunted by you just as he was haunted by my Alistair. Her confession hung in the air, a testament to a grief so profound it had become a meticulous, cold-blooded machine of vengeance. My husband was not a coward, Lillian said, her voice shaking with anger. Oh, wasn't he? Nora's smile was a terrifying slash in her face. That's the part you don't know, isn't it? The secret your precious James took to his grave. She paused, savoring the moment, using the words as her sharpest weapons. James wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the cover-up. He helped falsify the ledgers to protect his commanding officer long before Reeves ever showed up. He was just as guilty as the rest of them. The only reason he testified was because Clayton here backed him into a corner and left him no choice but to save his own skin. The revelation hit Clayton like a physical blow. James, complicit. It couldn't be true. The promise, the letter, his entire memory of his friend, it had all been built on a lie. He saw the shock and pain on Lillian's face, and his heart broke for her. Nora saw his momentary distraction and seized her chance. She fired. The shot went wide as Clayton dove for cover behind the heavy oak table. Splinters flew as the bullet buried itself in the wall behind him. The fight was no longer one of words. It was a desperate battle for survival in the storm-tossed house. He returned fire, aiming not to kill, but to disarm. The lamp on the far wall shattered, plunging the room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the brief, violent flashes of gunfire and the lightning that tore across the brown sky outside. The wind howled. The house groaned. In the disorienting dark, it became a battle of wits and senses. Clayton, using his scout's knowledge of the terrain, his own home moved silently, trying to flank her. He could hear her ragged breathing, the soft scuff of her boots on the sandy floor. He was a hunter in his element. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked above him. Thomas. The boy had climbed into the small loft above the kitchen. Clayton held his breath, praying the boy would stay hidden. A shape moved in the darkness near the pantry. Clayton fired. A cry of pain and the sound of a pistol clattering to the floor. He had her. he moved forward cautiously. "It's over, Nora." A small, choked laugh came from the shadows. "It will never be over." Then from the main room came a child's terrified scream. In the instant Clayton's head turned toward the sound, Nora lunged from the darkness, no longer holding a gun, but a long kitchen knife she had grabbed from the counter. She was impossibly fast. She slammed into him, the knife held high. They crashed to the floor in a desperate struggle. Her strength was feral, born of madness and hate. The point of the knife hovered inches from his face. Just as his strength was beginning to fail, a deafening blast echoed through the small kitchen. It wasn't his gun. Nora's body went rigid. The fire in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a look of stunned surprise. She slumped sideways, revealing Thomas standing in the doorway to the main room, a shotgun held in his trembling hands, smoke curling from the barrel. He had saved Clayton's life. He had saved them all. The storm raged on, but inside the house a deafening silence fell, broken only by the sound of a child's soft weeping. As dawn broke, the wind finally died, its fury spent. A weak, hazy sun rose over a world transformed, sculpted into new, unfamiliar shapes by the dust and sand. The world was quiet, as if holding its breath after a long, terrifying scream. Inside the house, the silence was just as profound. Nora Vance lay on the kitchen floor, a still and final testament to her all-consuming quest for revenge. Clayton had moved her, covering her with a blanket, an act of respect for the woman she once was, not the monster she had become. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the shotgun resting on the floor beside him, staring into space. His young face aged 100 years by the events of the night. Lillian was upstairs, her calm, steady voice a low murmur as she soothed the younger children back to sleep. When she came back down, she found Clayton washing the blood, Nora's and his own, from a shallow cut on his arm from the floorboards. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no words for the horror they had survived. Finally, Lillian sat down across from her son, her hand gently covering his. "Thomas," she said softly, "you were so brave. You saved us." Thomas flinched, pulling his hand away. "I killed her, Ma." The words were flat hollow. Clayton stopped his work and knelt beside the boy's chair. He put a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do, son. You protected your family. There's no shame in that. Only honor." He looked from the boy to his mother. "The burden of this is mine to carry, not yours." Later that morning, as if summoned by the storm's end, Marshal Whitley and his deputies rode into the yard. They had taken shelter in a line shack a few miles away and had seen the light from the ranch vanish during the storm. Whitley's face was grim as Clayton told him everything, leaving nothing out. He looked at Nora's body, at the splintered door, at the exhaustion etched on Clayton's and Lillian's faces, and simply nodded. The case of the Council Bluffs robbery was officially and tragically closed after the marshals left, taking Nora's body with them. An oppressive quiet descended once more. The physical threat was gone, but the emotional wreckage remained. Nora's final poisoned words about James Harper hung between Clayton and Lillian, an unspoken, painful truth that needed to be faced. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in a sky washed clean by the storm. The children were finally asleep, their slumber deep and peaceful. "Is it true?" Lillian asked, her voice barely a whisper, not looking at him. What she said about James. Clayton took a deep breath, the clean, cold air a balm on his raw nerves. He owed her the truth. All of it. "I don't know for sure," he began, speaking slowly, carefully. "James, he was a good man, Lillian, a good friend. But he was also ambitious. He wanted to be a hero, to make a name for himself. And he was loyal to his commanding officers, sometimes to a fault. It's possible. It's possible he was caught up in it deeper than I knew. It's possible he made a mistake he spent the rest of his life trying to outrun." He finally turned to face her. "I'm sorry, Lillian. I'm sorry that my past brought this to your door. And I'm sorry if the man you loved wasn't the perfect hero you remember." Lillian was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks like jagged black teeth against the star-dusted sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears, but it was steady. "No one is a perfect hero, Clayton. We are all just people, trying to do the best we can with what we're given." She turned her head, and in the faint starlight, he could see the profound grace and strength in her face. "James gave me 5 beautiful children and a life that was for a time full of love. Whatever mistakes he made, that is the truth I will choose to hold on to." She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm. "And you kept his promise. You kept us safe. That is the truth I will hold on to now." In that moment of raw honesty, under the vast, silent canopy of the western sky, the bond between them, forged in lies and desperation and violence, was finally purified by truth. It was no longer a partnership of necessity. It was a foundation solid and real upon which they could perhaps begin to build a future. The seasons turned. The scars on the land from the great dust storm healed, and new life, green and stubborn, pushed its way through the soil. So too did life on the ranch find a new, gentler rhythm. The echoes of that terrible night faded, replaced by the daily music of a family healing. Thomas slowly came back to himself, and the haunted look in his eyes replaced by the quiet confidence of a young man who had faced the worst and survived. The children's laughter became louder, their games more boisterous, their roots sinking deep into the rocky soil they now called home. Clayton and Lillian worked side by side, their partnership an easy, unspoken dance. They rebuilt the broken door, replanted the garden, and repaired the fences, and in the shared labor of reconstruction, they rebuilt themselves. The loneliness that had once been the defining feature of Clayton's existence was gone, banished by the warmth of a woman's hand in his, the sound of a child's question, the simple, profound peace of a shared meal at the end of a long day. He had sought a mail-order bride to cure his solitude. Instead, destiny had sent him a family to save his soul. One crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived bearing the official seal of the U.S. Army. It was from Clayton's contact at Fort Robinson, an old clerk who had finally unearthed what he was looking for. Tucked inside was a page carefully removed from a leather-bound journal. The handwriting was James Harper's, as it was his final entry, written in the last days of his fever. He confessed everything. He wrote of his shame, his complicity in the scandal, and the terrible weight of his guilt over Captain Vance's fate. He wrote of Clayton's unyielding integrity, and how it had both saved him and exposed him. "I failed as a soldier." The last line read, "And I failed my friend. But I pray I have not failed my wife and children. I have sent them to the one man I know whose honor is true. May he forgive me, and may he protect them." Lillian read the page, her hand trembling, silent tears tracing paths through the flour on her cheeks. It was a painful truth, but it was the truth. It was a confession that did not erase the man's flaws, but it confirmed the depth of his love. It was in its own way a final gift of peace. That evening, Clayton took the tarnished cavalry saber from the mantelpiece. For years, it had been a symbol of a friendship broken by betrayal and regret. He polished the steel until it gleamed, then walked into the main room where Lillian and the children were gathered by the fire. He looked at Lillian, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, a soft, understanding smile on her face. He hung the saber back on the mantel, not as a weapon, not as a relic of a painful past, but as an heirloom. It was a symbol of a complicated man, a flawed hero who, even from the grave, had tried to do right by his family. It was an acceptance of the past, all of it, the good and the bad, and a testament to the future they were now building together, The saber hung there, a piece of James Harper's legacy, now woven into the fabric of their new family, a silent guardian watching over the life that had been born from his last desperate hope.